Hello. So yesterday we got up to the point where Isabella had just, we think, was about to fall down into the fire pit. She's kind of having this sort of out-of-body experience, like, I suppose because she was so hot and she'd hit her head and we weren't really sure what was going on. So we've got chapter 22 to 25. I might power through them all. We'll see how it goes. I really want to get to the end. Okay, chapter 22. What are you doing? I was rising, my body pulled upwards. What the hell do you think you're doing? It was Loop, shouting at me, dragging me, my arm across her shoulders as heat sent the air roiling around us. Cracks were opening in the walls and she squeezed us through, my head knocking on the rock. Now I could feel the pain, all of it, through my back and shoulders, cutting across my legs, tearing at my head. It did not matter that Ma's map of the Forgotten Territories lay in shreds in my pocket. It was like carrying a map of the journey on my skin, each scrape a path that drew us further on, each bruise a reminder. And Yota's words burned into my brain, a line of white-hot beads threaded deep inside. You're too late. The ground gave an enormous wrench and I felt Loop carrying us forward even as a chasm opened beneath her feet. We curled ourselves into a tight tangle of limbs and dropped like stones. I wished for the end to be quick, to smash us against rock or into fire, but instead we clattered painfully downwards. The labyrinth would not release us. Yota wanted us in the depths of his maze where no light beyond his could reach. The rocks grew smooth under my back. A roaring sound filled my ears like water and fire and wind all mixed up together. But the shaking had stopped. I stopped rolling. I turned on my side so I could see Loop, my head spinning, the woodlight jutting painfully into my hip. We seemed to be in another cave, but this one stretched high, the ceiling out of sight. Are you all right? I'm getting used to falling down things. Her face was pale. I wish the ground would stop moving. How did you get to me? I shifted the rocks. I noticed her hands were covered in cuts, her fingernails shredded, her thin legs scraped. How had she carried me? Issa, what happened back there? I thought you were dead. So did I joked, but I could not tell her about the peeling away, the two selves, speaking to Yota. She would not believe me. I didn't know if I believed myself. I think I must have fainted. But I was saved from coming up with an explanation because Loop was no longer paying attention. Her eyes were fixed behind me. Issa, turn around. She looked as she had in the crystal cave. I followed her gaze and felt my jaw drop. Behind me, inches away, a black fire was cascading. A waterfall, a firefall, held in place by an invisible barrier. But the fire was not only travelling downwards, it was also pushing upwards, outwards, swirling this way and that, as if we had fallen beneath the sea, were watching it churn through glass. Glass. I crawled forward. No, Loop shouted. What are you doing? It's all right. I said, watch. I pressed the woodlight slowly into the black fire. Loop gasped as the surface gave slightly, like the skin on milk. Then she pulled herself forward so that we lay side by side on our bellies. This is incredible. What is this stuff? It's glass, I replied. Glass? She frowned. Like the windows in my house. Yes. But how is it here? That roaring sound, the sound like the sea. It's molten sand. Da told you, of course. But how does it work? It's sand. We must be under a beach. When you melt it, it forms glass. I'm not sure how exactly. This is black because bits of shell in the sand. Isn't sand always bits of shell? And other things, like crystals? I frowned at her. I thought you wanted me to tell you. I do. Da said that if you looked at glass up close, it would look like everything it's made of melted together. Sand, too. Sand would look like tiny shells. How does he know? I flushed. He's just guessing. But it would make sense. I waited for her to mock me, but she only said, I'd like to see sand up close. We watched the fire churn, silent a while. Then Loop asked, does glass melt then? I knew what she must really be asking. I suppose it must, if it's made by melting. Yes, she said. Doesn't seem fair, does it, to be so close to the sea and not be able to reach it? A bit like being in Grimera, I said. Her grin faded, I suppose. We watched the glass, not long left now. Soon it would shatter or melt, and there'd be nothing between us and Yota's flames. What happened then? Loop asked, in that way she had of picking a conversation long dropped. Did you fall, or... I don't know, I said quietly. I was sure I'd heard Yota. I was sure I'd left my body, but it wasn't possible. It didn't matter now. Nothing mattered. Nothing would ever matter again. I don't want to talk about it. Loop took my hand. How about I tell you a story? A story or a myth? I asked slyly. But she only put on a serious face and said, definitely a story. All right. Once, she cleared her throat theatrically. Once there was a girl. This girl was a mapmaker's daughter, but she insisted on everyone calling it cartography or something, and she thought her stories were the best and didn't want anyone else to tell them. I jabbed her hard in the side. That wasn't really the story, she spluttered. I guessed. The glass made a grinding sound and we jumped. There was no crack yet, but the shift in slide was more obvious now. Better hurry, I said. We sat cross-legged in front of each other. Loop began again. Once there was a country where a kind king and queen reigned. One day, the queen decided to go on a tour of her lands. She set off alone on a horse, but she was a strong rider. But a couple of days later, the king received a message from the village she was expected at first. She'd never arrived. The king rode for days, visiting village after village, enlisting more people to help him search for her. A week passed and the king collapsed, exhausted. They could not find his wife. The loss turned the king mad. The trees stopped bearing fruit and the rivers turned brown in their beds. The people wilted, grey as the sky, but this was not enough suffering for the king. He ordered higher taxes and organised troops of soldiers to visit other nearby lands and bring back mapmakers. He became obsessed with charting his country. Mapmaker after mapmaker came, but they were never good enough. The king wanted the maps to be bigger, more detailed. Then his men brought him a cartographer from the east, a clever, kind man who realised how much pain the king was in and vowed to do his best to help him. The cartographer came up with an idea. He proposed making a map without a scale, or rather, a map to the exact scale of the land. How do you know what a scale is? I couldn't help myself. Luke regarded me wearily. I do listen, you know. As if on cue, the glass creaked. I spun around, but before I could look, Luke grabbed my arms. It's better not to look, trust me. I nodded, holding her gaze. She took my hand again and continued, talking faster. The first things a mapmaker needs are paper and ink, and to read the stars. While the cartographer made star charts, great nets were set out across the forest to catch each insect. They were crushed to make different colours, and soon the cartographer had hundreds of vats of ink to use. Then the forests were felled to clear the view of the sky. Tree after tree was mashed with gallons of river water to make the paper. All the animals died, and the people began to be poisoned by the soiled river water. But the king did not care. He only wanted to find his wife. The cartographer began. He started at the western shore, laying down the paper and marking it where the houses and rivers were. When he covered the crops of paper, they died from lack of sun, but still the king did not care. His subjects began to leave the land and sail to other countries to be ruled by men less mad and cruel. Soon, only the king and his cartographer remained. The map was almost done when the cartographer found the skeletons of the queen and her horse on a remote stretch of coast. He rode across the paper miles to tell the king. The king was so overcome with grief that his heart began to burst. The doctor had fled the place long ago, so there was nothing to be done. He died in the cartographer's arms. She stopped. I shuddered. What happened to the map? Luke let out a bark of laughter. Only you would ask what happened to the map. I waited. But what did? She shrugged. I don't know. The rain broke it to pieces, or the cartographer made it into a ship and sailed out to sea. Really? You know it's just a story. Yes, I paused. It was the best story I've ever heard. Who told you it? She grinned broadly. You did? No, really? She repeated, softer this time. You. My smile faded. What? You made it up for my birthday 3 years ago when we first became friends. You made me a map to the rabbit warren and we sat by it while you told me. I liked it so much I wrote it down when I got home. You really don't remember. I shook my head slowly. I only remembered realising too late that I didn't have a present for Loop and telling her the first thing that came to my mind. I had no idea she liked it enough to memorise it, let alone write it down. I read it all the time at home. It has all your favourite things, adventures, maps, and a sad ending, I added. And that. The glass creaked, and this time Loop was too slow to stop me looking. Near the top, where the glass was thickest, a crack had split the pane like a fissure in rock. A flame licked the centre of the lining, and the glass bubbled. We broke away from each other, throwing ourselves backwards. The flames had not yet come through, but whole swathes of the surface were sliding down, bubbling into a threatening pool at the bottom. I backed right up against the opposite wall of the glass-fronted cave. Something jabbed into my head. Ouch! My fingers came away sticky with blood. Loop staunched the flow with her raggedy dress. What happened? I hit my head. What on? I snatched the woodlight from my belt and held it up to the wall. Jutting from the surface was a shadowy shape. It looked like an irregular piece of rock, only lighter, but when I held it to the woodlight closer, it glinted. It was not rock at all. It was metal. End of chapter 22. We're just going to carry on. Yeah. 23. It can't be, I murmured. Arinta's sword. But it had to be. The shape was rusted with age, but if I squinted I could change the indentations on the surface into engravings. And if I was right about the sea being the other side of the rock, only the sea can defeat the fire demon. This was our final chance, a gift passed down through 1,000 years. I said it myself, that glass was molten sand. That meant we were beneath a beach, maybe even the beach near Gomera, and that roaring, the roaring that sounded so much like wind and fire, and most of all, water. I brushed my fingers against the sword. It was hot, the metal dull and unpolished, but I felt a surge of energy rush through my skin. My heart threw itself against my chest. I tried to grasp the hilt, but the metal was too hot. I bunched my tunic in my hand and tried again, but it was stuck fast. I wrenched and wrenched, until Luke placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. The fight went out of me like air. I felt tears starting in my eyes, gritty and hot. You're right, I said bitterly. I'm not her. But the sword's here. Luke pulled me into a hug. It's real, Issa. It's not a story. I sniffed. I had been so sure the sword would turn for me. Behind us, the glass gave another crack. An intense heat flooded the cave, and I looked around in time to see the cracks open into a hole, small but filling rapidly with flame. The air seemed to suck itself through, draining the cavern and filling it with heat. As we watched, the glass dripped down, widening the crack, letting a thin stream of molten rock thread its way through. I turned to Loop, but she'd already placed her hand on the hilt. I saw it blister and smelt burnt skin. Loop, stop! I tried to pull her scorched hand away, but she pushed me back, eyes wild. I have to, Issa. I have to make amends. For what? My father? I don't understand. I reached out to her, but she stepped back, shaking, blazing with anger. My father knew. He didn't believe it, but he knew about Yota. I gaped at her. The letter said so. Loop dug her fingernails into her palms, and I could see the skin peeling. That's why he came here. He killed his farmer and was sent here as a punishment. For redemption, I murmured, but Loop had not heard me. He was meant to help everyone leave, help them escape Yota, but he took over instead. He was rotten, like you said. It's not your fault, I said carefully, trying to make sense of what she was saying. The governor had known Yota wasn't a myth. But before I could ask more, she gripped the hilt again. The metal fizzed against her palms. Loop, don't! I started towards her, but suddenly, it's working! The sword began to move, to turn. 1,000 years of pressure seemed to release in an instant, though this instant separated itself into distinct moments that would burn on my mind forever. First, another hiss rose to join the one from Loop's palms. The second moment, a thin stream of water began to spurt out. The third moment, it grew into a torrent. Just as the fire broke through the glass with a deafening crash, the water threw itself towards it. We collapsed under the weight of the sea. Somehow we found each other's hands. The world turned, not only upside down but side to side. The ground was ripped again and again. I held on to Loop in the tumult, or was it that she held on to me? Though her fingers had to be painful from the turning sword, I was pressed down, ears popping as the force of the ocean pinned us in its grasp, thrusting us deeper. We were drowning. Pressure roared through my head. My eyes bulged, breath forced from my chest. The water smashed through Yota's 1,000-year labyrinth as though it were paper, buffeting us along its currents, its power finally released. All I could do was hold fast to Loop's hand. It was the only thing anchoring me. As suddenly as the world had turned inside out, it righted. My head surfaced, hitting solid rock. I spluttered, spitting out water and blood. My tongue throbbed where I'd bitten it. My arm was being pulled to the surface too, and then I realised why. I was still holding the woodlight. It was bobbing on the rushing water, steadfast as great-grandfather Ross's boat. I pulled Loop forward as she grasped the woodlight too. Gripping onto it and to each other, we rode the streaming sea through what I could only guess was one of the tunnels that made up the maze. There was no sign of Tiberchanas or of Yota in his flames. He was gone, swallowed by the ocean. Our legs were being snatched at and wrenched down, even as the woodlight kept us afloat. I clenched my teeth as my feet were swirled and pulled until I felt sure my ankles would break. We were swept into a high cave. My feet scraped painfully along the submerged rock. Caught between the current and the stone, I cried out and felt Loop kick my feet out the way. There was a strange feeling of resistance, a dull thunk like a clay pot breaking. Then the current released us slightly. Loop turned her exhausted gaze upon me, bringing up a lungful of water so violently that she almost lost her grip on the woodlight. She was hurt. "Hold on." I clamped my hand over hers, looking around frantically. A few metres away, a fainter patch of dark caught my eye. There was an opening. I shouted for joy and instantly swallowed a mouthful of salty water. "Look!" Loop's eyes lifted and she nodded. But there was something wrong. Her pupils were huge, as if night had slid beneath them. I kicked her, my movements slowed by the sea, and tried to keep her awake. She must have hit her head. I brought my mouth close to her ear and shouted, "It's all right, I'll get us home." The water was rising, and we tilted our heads back to keep our mouths in the pocket of air. I wrapped my spare hand around Loop's waist and began to kick towards the opening. The hole was perfectly round. It looked almost man-made. Objects were bobbing on the water, bits of cloth, and something that looked very much like bone. One nudged at my face and I pushed it away, fighting to swim closer to the light. It would all be worth it if I could only get to the surface. Just as the water started to close over our heads, I reached the mouth of the opening. I pulled Loop beside me and together we gulped in air. Above us, the tunnel seemed to stretch forever. Perhaps it would take us to a way out. But it was narrowing. I could barely squeeze through. Suddenly we stopped rising. My hand was wrenched upwards as the woodlight tried to stay with the surge. I looked down, eyes stinging, trying to pull Loop with me, but instead saw her dress tugging at her shoulders. It had already caught on something. I tried to tear her free, but her body had already wedged in the thinning gap. She was stuck. We were running out of time. The water was high over our heads. My body convulsed, desperate for air. Loop pushed at me. I saw her mouth working and shook my head. I couldn't tell what she was saying. She tried again, smiling sadly, bubbles spiralling, still the smallest in the class. Then she let go of the woodlight. I clenched my hand around hers. "No." Time suspended itself like a stopped clock as we gazed at each other's blurred faces through the whirling water. My head felt full and empty at the same time, aching. The bright stars were back, my chest screaming. Loop squeezed my hand softly and rammed the sharp point of the woodlight into my shoulder. I gasped and rose as fast as a bubble, Loop slipping through my fingers. The pain of my shoulder wrapped itself around me. I tried to pull the woodlight out, but could not. I looked down through the reddening water and saw that Loop's arm was raised, the bracelet glinting on her wrist, her face calm, the last circles of air leaving her mouth, and then she was gone. That's the end of chapter 23. That's a sad chapter. We've lost Loop at the end of the chapter. She sacrificed herself to save Isabella and to save Joya. So perhaps she's like a Rinter, isn't she? So we've got chapter 24 and chapter 25, and then we're at the end. I think we need to find out what happens. This is going to be a bit of a long video. We're already at 20 minutes, but I think probably you can always watch it in 2 goes if you get bored. Chapter 24. The water spat me into more dark. I landed hard, not on earth but rock. It forced the woodlight out of my shoulder, and agony rolled across my body. Blood spread warmly over my tunic as voices broke over me like a wave. It's a child. What's happening? Where's the water coming from? I vomited seawater, skin stinging with salt. More water was rushing from the circular hole by my head. Many sets of hands were pulling me away. I was lifted beneath my armpits and made to stand. I swayed, feeling water rushing over my ankles. Voices reverberated around and a horrid stench of mould and rot reached my nostrils. I knew this smell. I opened my eyes. Uncomprehending faces stared back, blinking in the glow from the woodlight. I was in the middle of the Daedalo. The underworld is emptying, shrieked a man excitably. It's Isabella, said another. My eyes darted around. That voice. Pablo loomed over me, Masha at his side, more hunched than ever. How was he here? His face was stitched roughly at the forehead and chin, but he was smiling. The old woman unwrapped her shawl and tied it tightly around the bleeding shoulder and wound in my shoulder. Are you all right, child? How did you... Look, said the excitable man, pointing down. The water was still rising. The woodlight bobbed by my calves, and I picked it up with my good hand. Everyone began running in the same direction. Pablo threw a kicking Masha over his shoulder and grabbed me. Come. But it was too much, all of it. I tried to wrench my hand from his, but then in the silvery light I saw a familiar face. The figure came limping up to me and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Da. I held him with my good arm until I was sure he was really there. Until I was sure I was really there. There was so much I wanted to say, but my throat was closed tight. He released me and took the woodlight so he could hold my hand. Together we followed the fleeing crowds. Da leant heavily on me, but he was moving more swiftly than I thought possible. The passages were nearly as narrow as the labyrinth. From left and right came shouts of confusion, and more people flooded from the darkness to join the stampede upwards. The water was sucking at my hips now, and I felt a fresh wave of panic as I looked up. A vast set of narrow stairs stretched before us, seething with people. From high above came cries for help and a hammering. We were not safe yet. What's happening? Shouted a woman in front. The question went echoing upwards. A few seconds later, the answer was passed down the staircase. It's locked. The trapdoor is locked. The people behind us were pushing forwards, away from the swirling seawater, crushing us. Those on the staircase clung white-knuckled to the thin rope that served as a banister. The people behind kept pushing. Others were going to be forced off the edge. Stop! Shouted Dar, but it was no use. Panic had taken hold. I racked my sluggish brain for a plan, but no ideas surfaced. The water was still rising, seeping into the bottom of my tunic now, my trousers soaked and heavy. I felt a sharp scratch through the material and reached into the pocket to find the thin gold key poking through. I pulled out the keyring. The 6 other keys glinted through the water. I tried to cry out, but still my voice would not come. I tugged at Dar's sleeve and held them up. He looked blank a moment, then saw the royal blue crest on the keyring. He shoved me forward. Go, Isabella, run! So I did, every muscle in my body screaming to shop. I pushed blindly through the crowds, ignoring the shouts of anger and yelps of pain as I trod on feet and raked my nails across the hands that tried to stop me. The steps seemed never-ending, but just as my legs started to shape, I saw the trapdoor. Illuminated by a lamp swaying from a panicked man's arm. He was beating at the wood while another scratched at the lock, his nails bleeding, but no one came. I pushed up the last few steps and pulled at the man's arm. He looked down, eyes wild, and I held up the ring of keys. He grabbed at them, but his hands were shaking so much he dropped them. They nearly fell off the step into the crowd below. I snatched the keys up. A scream came from the base of the stairs. I could not help myself. The water was up to people's waists. I shook my head to clear it and reached up to test the first key, trying to ignore the tearing sensation in my shoulder. It did not fit the lock. I took up the next one, fingers trembling as the man beside me hissed fearfully, "Quickly, child!" More screaming from below, and sounds of thrashing as the shorter prisoners fought to stay afloat or were held up by their companions. The second key slotted into the lock but would not turn, nor would the third. Finally, with a deep wrenching sound, the fourth key began to turn. The man yelped in excitement and helped me rotate it in the rusty lock. Then he and 2 others placed their shoulders against the trapdoor and started the push. They could not lift it. One of the men screamed, pointing at the edges of the trapdoor. Huge rusted spikes showed through. "They've nailed us in!" Then he was being pushed aside as Pablo moved past and put his shoulder to the wood. He heaved once, the stitches contorting his face, and the trapdoor swung off its hinges. The light flooded over us like a wave, and the man behind me moaned, shielding his eyes. Pablo jumped into the corridor of the governor's house and helped me stumble out. I only had a moment to register that the torches were burning without a guard in sight, before Pablo grabbed me. He hugged me hard and I let him, gasping as my shoulder throbbed, his hands impossibly warm through my tunic. Then he pushed me behind him against the wall, running forward to help the first rush of people scramble into the hallway. A seemingly endless stream began dashing down the 4 corridors in an effort to make room, some joining Pablo in helping the elderly or injured out of the steep stairwell. The faces grew more and more harrowed, the clothes more and more soaked. "Where's Dar?" I croaked as Pablo helped a woman out. Before I could stop him, Pablo was gone, pushing down the stairwell and into the sloshing darkness of the Daedalo. I wanted to follow, but the throb in my shoulder has intensified and I stayed pressed up against the wall. Opposite was the pinned butterfly, and I kept my eyes trained on it as bodies rushed past. How could so many people have been in the Daedalo? An ancient-looking man emerged with a long beard wrapped around his arm, his eyes unseeing. Masha collapsed out of the hole after him. Finally, I saw the top of Pablo's head, black hair flattened by a damp, pulling someone's arm. Dar emerged, dripping wet and sucking his cheeks in the way he did when he was in pain, and Pablo slung his arm across his shoulders to help him walk. It made me remember Loop doing the same for me in the maze, and I cried out as they hurried towards me. There were 2 more men behind them, and they seemed to be the last because together they heaved the trapdoor shut. I was numb to everything except Dar. I pulled away from the wall and forced my feet the few steps towards him, falling into his arms. An ear-splitting grinding spread through the house, and a fierce tremor ripped lamps from the walls. I tumbled to the floor, Pablo throwing himself over me and Dar as the lamps smashed onto the cloth, spilling their fire. We were helped to our feet and ran, all of us, down the corridors of the house like ants fleeing a nest. The fire was ripping at the ground, making quick work of the elegant tapestries and paintings. I felt like as if I was back in Yota's lair, and wondered whether we'd be crushed before we burnt. The ground wrenched again, shaking the house. A huge crack opened in the wall of the corridor, and my legs were quaking, skittering beneath me. But suddenly we were outside in the courtyard by the stables, and it was raining harder than I'd ever seen it rain before. The ground was churning mud, shaking so hard it was impossible to stand. I fell as there was another violent twist and a monstrous crunching sound that vibrated through my whole body. A noise like thunder scraped the air. The stalls in the market square, pockets small at this distance, were crumbling, sending dust into the torrential rain. The Arantara was already bursting its banks to the north, flowing over the rubble, and the well in the centre of the square was sending water plumbing up, was like a fountain. "The sea!" shouted Dar through a mouthful of mud. "It's pulling Joya free!" The sea seemed to give a last brutal tug. The ground rocked from side to side, and I saw huge waves breaking over the bay below, sucking broken houses into the water. The blackened shell of the governor's ship pitched and strained at its moorings, but I could see no other boats. Wind whipped at our clothes, beginning to draw the rain clouds back like a curtain. They disappeared. The rain swept away with them, and we were dazzled by sunshine, except against the usual blue. The tremors slowed, then ceased. The ground stopped rocking as if the island were trying to find some balance. I was winded, yet lungs are useless as I tried to catch my breath. Around me, people were standing up, starting to call out to each other. Behind us, the governor's house was shattered, the roof collapsed. "It's floating," said Dar. "Joya's floating. Isabella, what did you do?" I could still not find my voice. The sea that Loop had freed, had scooped out the base of Joya, snapping the island from its stem like a water lily. I'd heard of floating islands, circling the world like living ships, at the mercy of the current. I'd been entranced by those stories, but now I did not care. As the blue of the Joya sky spread above me, and fathoms of sea flowed beneath, I closed my eyes and wept. Oh, so good. That's the end of chapter 24. It's all getting very moving at this point. So they're safe. They're all safe. They're all safe apart from Loop. And Loop saved Joya. The island is now floating. It's been ripped free from the seabed. And because of what Isabella and Loop did and the sacrifice that Loop made, the island is now safe and Yota is destroyed. And everything will be okay, we hope. And so we now have the final chapter. And it has a different location. Somewhere on the Western Sea. One year later. Chapter 25. Do you know how fast a floating island moves? I do. Some days it's like riding a giant sea turtle, slow as sleep. Other nights when the moon is close and full and the waves rise high as mountains, making Pep yowl, it's like running quick as the wind. So the answer is, a floating island moves as fast as it wants to. I think even Dar thought we'd have reached some other land by now. According to his calculations, the current is taking us west, towards America. Dar could board a passing ship and get there faster, but he says, why leave a ship that is also our home? We'll get there one day soon. Every day he charts our progress across the Western Sea on our walls. We've gone in so many circles it looks like Miss La's tracks. She found her way home with Pablo, who regained consciousness after Loop and I started walking the labyrinth. He called and called and was sure we were dead. When he reached Gramera, he told the governor's men what had happened, tried to get them to go back and help, but they didn't believe him. They threw him in the Daedalus, and it was only when the surviving banished arrived that they realised he'd been telling the truth. That's when they nailed down the trapdoor, boarded whatever boats they could find, and left for Afric with Signora Adori. I'm glad Loop never has to know how easily her mother abandoned her. Otherwise, less than you'd think has changed. My hair is a year longer, my shoulder nearly healed. My voice came back eventually, though I still don't like to use it much. Pablo's face has 2 thick scars across it, and I tease him that he's almost as lined as Masha, but really I think he looks fine. Dar has built me a small room in the garden to work in. It's made of rushes and mud, and we invited my class from school to paint it. Only on the outside, though. Inside, I'm starting my own map wall. With the port open again, we trade with passing ships, and most people have rebuilt their houses the same way. Dar even bought some green paint for our new door, and a whole aviary of songbirds from a junk in Chine. We released them last week, and now they sing in every tree. There's a tiny jewel blue one tweeting loudly outside in Gabbo's tababa bush. It's flowering again. The storm washed out a lot of the other plants, but this one only grows and grows. Buried beneath it are the governor's keys. I still don't honestly know what happened in the labyrinth. I told Dar what I could about the Tiberchainus, the map's hidden layer, though he only has my word. The map is destroyed and the demon dogs vanished. Perhaps the sea swallowed them as it swallowed their master. It's hard to know the facts, or if facts even matter with an ending like a floating island, but I do know that Loop saved my life with her sacrifice, saved all of us, saved Joya like Arinta did 1001 years ago. There's no way I can say a true goodbye to her, but I can say thank you. I'm about to finally finish my map of Joya, the island as it is now. Dar and I have made 3 trips to see what I missed, and some of the villages are already populated again. The forests are thick and green, and all the Gramerans got together to buy boar and deer from a ship from Europa. I saw a fawn on our last trip, drinking from the pool beneath Arantan. The waterfall is back to its full might, but I don't like to go behind it to see where Loop and I fell through. I don't like to be in the dark where the stars don't shine. Where the governor's house used to be, a dragon tree has been planted. It grows higher each day, roots threading through the remains of the Daedalus. I left this to last, the final landmark to be filled in. I carefully stitch it to my map as a golden starburst, using the same spool as I did for Loop's bracelet. You're so sentimental, Loop would say. Next to it, I write 2 words, Loop's tree. I sit back, vision blurry from so many days crouched over the map, but when I blink down at it, rolling my sore shoulder as I trace the greens of the forest, the blue of the rivers, the faint stitch of star lines, I don't just see ink and thread on paper. There's something else there, something close to the same life Dar's maps have. Maybe. Don't get big-headed on me, Loop warns. Isabella, breakfast ready? Dar calls from the kitchen. The porridge smells as burnt as ever. Coming. I look down at the completed map, wondering whether to laugh or cry. No point just standing there. And I will not. With Joya pulled in the wake of an unknown current, I will never stand still again. And that's the end of the book. What a great ending. Oh, it's brilliant. So the island has been reborn, basically, hasn't it? Now that Loop has set it free. And I think what's interesting here is if we go back to the quote that's on the back, each of us carries the map of our lives on our skin, in the way we walk, even in the way we grow. And that's what's happened to them now. These memories, these experiences, even the physical scars, but also the scars that are not physical, but they are there inside of them, of their experiences. Those are the maps of their lives. They're the way that they tell the story through which the characters have been, in the way that they've grown, and also the way that they talk about things. So I think it's a brilliant book. So well done for choosing that one, voting for it. I will put some comprehension questions together, and in my last when I recorded my last video, Sai has sent me some videos of a map that he has made from his house to Matteo's house, using Isabella's method of marking every 100 paces, which I think is a really nice idea. And you could even scale it down if you wanted to make a map of your somewhere in your house, or if you've got a garden, or if you've got a communal space outside, you could maybe do marking every 10 paces or something like that, and make your own. But I think if you do that, and a little bit like Sai's done with making a map to Matteo's house, because obviously that's part of his experience, Isabella's map is her map, the map of her life, the map of the places that she's been, the map of her life. So I think if you want to make a map that is the map of your life, that shows things that are important to you, that could be a really lovely piece of artwork that you could do. So anyway, this has been a very long video. I hope you've managed to get to the end. We will be back after the half term, fingers crossed, in the building, because I've got a fantastic book for you to be working on. If not in the building, we will start it virtually. But I hope that we can be together, or at least in the same place. Not all of us together, obviously. But yeah, I think you'll really love it. Kind of continuing on the theme of a little bit of magic, because life's better with a bit of magic in it, isn't it? So I hope you enjoyed that. I loved it. And I look forward to hearing your responses when I put up my comprehension questions. I'll try and put them up over the next few days, but you don't have to do them in half term if you need a break. But if you do them in half term, bonus points. Bye.